Not all crowns sparkle with power. Some burn with secrets. Buried deep within the Tower of London lies a set of jewels no royal dares speak of. And when one woman, young, adored, and unprepared, tried to claim her rightful place, she was told a chilling phrase: "You may be royal, but you're not her." What had she just uncovered? Before we begin, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us make more videos like this. Long before tourists flocked to the jewel house or glossy books documented each diamond in pristine precision, there was another ledger. Not displayed, not digital. Ink on parchment, kept in a drawer that required both a key and a silence vow. In its pages were names of jewels never photographed, never displayed. Some were gifted in secret, others reclaimed in disgrace. But all of them had one thing in common. They were excluded from the official crown jewels collection. Not lost, not stolen, hidden. Among these entries was one that stood out to those few allowed to read it. A tiara with no formal name, only a chilling annotation. Last worn, 1897. Following event: widowhood, early death. At its center, a blood-red Burmese ruby said to pulse in candlelight. The jewel was described as heavy, not only in weight, but in presence. In family circles, it came to be called the mourning flame. Not because it was worn in grief, but because grief followed those who wore it. Yet even more curious than the jewel itself was the pattern surrounding it. Whispers among palace staff, embroidered over generations, spoke of a rule. Not a law, not something written in constitutional ink, but a deeper, older kind of decree. A rule passed from queen to queen, spoken quietly and without question. Some jewels are only for those who carry the crown, not for those who simply wear it. And so the flame stayed locked away, untouched, unseen. Until one day, it was nearly asked for. Diana, beautiful, magnetic, already fraying under the pressure of spectacle and scrutiny, stood in front of a mirror during one of her earliest fittings. Surrounded by rows of tiaras, bracelets, brooches, she was being shown what to wear, what not to, what complemented her collarbones and what was too heavy for the press. And then she tilted her head, caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. A case, tucked into a lower shelf, slightly dusted. She pointed, almost innocently. "And what about that one?" The room froze. One dresser dropped a pin, another coughed. And finally, the oldest among them, who had once served Queen Mary herself, stepped forward and said, "That one's not for you." No explanation, no denial of its existence, just a line drawn in the air, sharp, unmistakable. From that moment on, Diana never asked again. But the look in her eyes changed. Not because she wanted the ruby, not even because she felt slighted, but because, for the first time, she realized there were things in this family more sacred than lineage, more dangerous than scandal. Things that power itself feared. These jewels were more than adornments. They were warnings, reminders, symbols of a legacy not meant for every royal woman. Only the ones deemed worthy by forces unseen. Behind every glittering display, there was a locked drawer, a missing line in the registry, and a memory that could not be buried. And within that quiet omission lived a truth that would outlive queens. But who made the rules? And why was one woman told she'd never be allowed to wear them? Beyond the velvet ropes and tourist cameras, there exists a vault the public will never see. Locked behind biometric doors and protected by private edicts, it contains the monarchy's most closely guarded secrets. Not documents, but diamonds. Welcome to the Shadow Vault. It's not a myth. It's not a legend whispered by royal obsessives or a footnote in dusty biographies. It is real. Beneath the Tower of London, beneath even the known crown jewels collection, lies a second chamber, smaller, colder, and infinitely more powerful in its secrecy. This vault is known only to a handful of individuals, the reigning monarch, 2 members of the Privy Council, and 1 archivist, whose name never appears on public payrolls. There is no tour. There is no signage. Even staff who've worked in the jewel house for decades have never laid eyes on it. And yet, it holds the most explosive inheritance in British royal history. Unlike the crown jewels, meticulously listed and showcased under bulletproof glass, the contents of the Shadow Vault are not catalogued in any official registry. No photographs, no public appraisals, but according to internal ledgers, fragments of private letters, and veiled memoirs, its contents include more than just forgotten treasures. These are the pieces that tell the darker side of monarchy, the affairs, the betrayals, the exiles. Pieces that were quietly removed from history when their wearers fell from favor. Jewels given in secret during love affairs that threatened succession. Necklaces retrieved from duchesses who defied protocol. Tiaras whose last wearers died in disgrace or silence. The origins of this vault stretch back to the early 20th century. During a scandal the palace still refuses to acknowledge in full. In 1910, after a member of the royal family was embroiled in a financial and romantic scandal with a foreign noble, Queen Mary acted swiftly. Without fanfare, she ordered several key pieces, gifts from that liaison, to be removed from rotation. A trusted footman recorded her words, "Let what was never right be never seen again." Thus began the era of concealment. Not destruction, because nothing is truly destroyed in the monarchy, but burial, symbolic burial. And the vault became its grave. As the decades passed, more items were added, not necessarily cursed by magic, but cursed by memory. A diamond choker worn by a duchess who fled her royal marriage and never returned. A pair of earrings traced back to a murdered Russian heiress who dined with Edward VII. A ruby-studded bracelet believed to have belonged to Wallis Simpson and quietly removed from Windsor Castle after her death. These were not discarded. They were locked away, as if the jewels themselves carried the reputations of the women who wore them. And then came Elizabeth II. Her reign was about order, control, dignity. But even she knew there were relics too dangerous to reintroduce. According to a former royal dresser, the Queen once remarked, "Not all should wear what they cannot carry." It was her way of acknowledging the weight these objects bore, not in carats, but in consequence. To wear a piece from the Shadow Vault was not simply to adorn oneself in diamonds. It was to resurrect a story the crown had buried. And stories like that come with a price. The Shadow Vault is not about vanity or grandeur. It is about containment, of emotion, of scandal, of women who crossed invisible lines and paid dearly for it. And perhaps that's why no woman was ever supposed to ask. Because asking meant remembering, and remembering meant reckoning. But history has a way of slipping through the cracks. And destiny, it seems, does not care for protocol. And then came a bride who unknowingly asked for a piece from the Shadow Vault for her wedding day. The gift box was exquisite, white satin ribbon, the Queen's seal, and a handwritten card. Inside, a tiara too beautiful to be real, and something else, a folded note with 7 words that would haunt her marriage. She never asked for this. She only wanted to belong. The night before her wedding, Catherine Middleton was alone in her private quarters. The palace was humming with activity. Security teams finalizing protocols, designers checking seams, florists rushing in blooms fit for a 1,000-year monarchy. But in that quiet room, far from the chaos, she opened a box that wasn't on the official schedule. It came with no announcement, no press coverage, no handler watching closely. just a sealed envelope with her name in the Queen's hand, and the unmistakable weight of a choice disguised as a gift. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a tiara she had never seen in any royal portrait or museum archive. Not the Cartier halo she had tried on weeks earlier, not the Spencer tiara the public still romanticized. This one was different. Angular, bold, set with rubies so deep they looked almost black under soft light. It glowed like something alive. An attached card read simply, "She asked too." She wore it anyway. The note hit her like a riddle. Who was she? And why did it feel like a warning instead of a blessing? At first, Catherine felt honored. Maybe this was the Queen's quiet way of acknowledging her. A private nod that she belonged, that she was ready to carry the history others couldn't. But the more she stared at the tiara, the more unease began to settle in her chest. It was as if the piece itself carried a presence, a heaviness no amount of diamonds could lighten. And yet, how could she refuse it? It was a gift from the Queen, a signal of trust, of passage. Later that evening, during a final private fitting with her stylist and a senior palace aide, Catherine tried it on. The moment the tiara touched her head, the room changed. The aide gasped, not in admiration, but in what looked unmistakably like panic. She stepped forward, almost instinctively, and muttered, "No one's worn that since, well, since her." She didn't elaborate. Catherine wasn't sure she needed her to. Behind closed doors, as the bride prepared in confusion, another conversation was unfolding. The Queen and an unnamed advisor stood in the royal study, the tiara's absence already noticed. The advisor spoke first. She found the flame. The Queen didn't respond. Not at first. Then came the sentence that would echo through corridors of power and protection. She can't wear that. It's too soon. But too soon for what? Too soon to evoke a memory that still haunted the monarchy? Too soon to wear what another had worn with defiance and paid for in sorrow? For Catherine, the message was clear, though no one said it outright. This wasn't just a fashion decision. This was about legacy, about ghosts that had never been buried. And though she hadn't asked for the flame, she had been handed its fire. And so, just hours before the ceremony, the decision was made. The flame would return to the vault. Again, they say the tiaras were beautiful, but behind the glamour, they shattered marriages, silenced love affairs, and drove wedges between sisters. These were not accessories. These were instruments of royal punishment and warning. Catherine wasn't the first to touch something she was never meant to wear. And as she stood on the edge of stepping into history, she began to feel the tremors of those who had tried before her. The deeper she was pulled into the private undercurrents of the royal family, the more she realized certain pieces didn't disappear because they were lost. They vanished because they were too dangerous to be worn again. Long before her, there was another woman who reached for what she shouldn't. Diana, young and already wounded, had once asked to wear the Swan Heart Emerald, a piece rarely spoken of outside private archives. It was said to have been a wedding gift to Queen Alexandra, later buried in scandal after it was linked to a romantic betrayal during the First World War. Diana, bold and aching to redefine her place in the family, saw it during a private consultation. She had whispered, carefully, "Could I try this one?" The response had come not from a stylist, but from a royal aide dispatched from the Queen herself. Absolutely not. No explanation, no alternative, just finality. It was the end of the conversation, and the beginning of Diana's suspicion that in this family, jewels were wielded like power, granted only when loyalty was proven, or submission ensured. Then came the Duchess of Windsor, Wallis Simpson, a woman who gave up everything, or rather, was forced to live without everything, to be with the man who gave up a throne. Exiled and excommunicated in all but name, Wallis had written a private letter in 1956 asking if she might reclaim a sapphire brooch Edward had gifted her in the early days of their courtship. A brooch with royal provenance locked in the Tower after their exile. The answer came not from a family member, but through lawyers. The brooch is no longer in circulation. It wasn't true. The brooch had simply been relabeled, moved into the shadow vault. The message was crystal clear. Forgiveness had limits, and even love sanctioned by abdication would not be rewarded with inheritance. And what of Princess Margaret? Loyal yet restless, regal yet rebellious. At a state dinner in 1967, she wore a bracelet not cleared through official channels. Small, elegant, but controversial. It had once belonged to a great-aunt with a disgraced legacy, and its reappearance was viewed as an act of subtle defiance. 3 weeks later, Margaret was dispatched on a tour to the Caribbean, a move many saw as diplomatic. But insiders whispered it was exile in disguise. The bracelet never surfaced again. Each of these pieces left more than a trail of diamonds and gold. They left scars, emotional fallout, family silence, public humiliation. They carried reputations, tragedies, stories soaked in unspoken conflict. It wasn't just about heritage. It was about hierarchy. These women didn't simply defy fashion choices. They defied a system that cloaked control in velvet and crowned silence in platinum. Catherine, piecing together what little she could from fragments of conversation and veiled anecdotes, began to see the pattern. The same types of pieces, the same whispered refusals, the same fallout, and above all, the same unbreakable barrier that always appeared when a woman tried to wear a jewel she wasn't supposed to. It didn't matter who they married, how beloved they were, or how much the public adored them. The rule was bigger than them, older, sharper than any diamond. And so she began to wonder, not just who was denied, but why. Because if these women were punished not for who they were, but for what they dared to wear, then the jewels weren't cursed. The system was. And the weight of that realization pressed against her like the very crowns she'd never yet worn. But what exactly was the rule? And who first declared it? When the Queen died, 3 safes were opened. 2 were expected. The third shocked even her closest advisors. Inside, 5 items, 1 audio recording, and a note that read, "Not until she asks the right question." What truth did the Queen take to her grave? There had always been whispers about the Queen's private estate safe. Not the official vault at Buckingham, nor the ceremonial strongbox in Windsor. This one was different. It wasn't guarded by protocol, but by personal discretion. Known only to her 2 most trusted aides, it was kept far from the reach of biographers, family, or even her own children. It had no index, no record, only access and silence. When it was finally unlocked, after her death, what lay inside wasn't treasure. It was legacy, laid out carefully in perfect order. A photo of Diana, not one the public had seen, but an intimate moment, soft, unguarded. A sealed letter addressed to Charles, its contents unknown even now. A ring, dull with time, that hadn't been worn in over 4 decades. A single brass key with no label. And then the tape. An old audio recording marked only with the Queen's cipher. On the tape, Elizabeth's voice was clear but tired, carrying the weight of a crown she had worn longer than anyone before her. She spoke not of history, but of burden. "There is a difference," she said, "between wearing a crown and carrying its weight. Some wear it and dazzle. Others feel it press on their bones." There was a pause, then a confession. "After her, I decided no one would wear those pieces again, not until they understood what they meant. I've hidden them not out of cruelty, but out of protection." Her voice trembled only once, when she spoke Diana's name. She thought she was ready, but she never knew the rules. Then came a silence so long, the tape nearly ended before the Queen spoke again. "If she asks the right question, give her everything." Catherine never knew the recording existed, but she would later hear from someone who did. A quiet conversation behind palace doors, a passing remark over tea, and then the line that cut through all the pageantry. "It's not for you. Not yet." At first, she accepted it, because she was trained to, because in this family, answers came slowly, if at all. And sometimes they didn't come at all. But there was a shift, a sense that something had been left behind not as punishment, but as preparation. That the Queen hadn't just locked something away, she had left a test, a final gatekeeper watching from beyond the veil. And Catherine, still haunted by the jewels she couldn't wear, the note she couldn't forget, and the legacy she was being asked to inherit, began to wonder. What was the question she wasn't asking? But then she asked the right question, and doors began to open. The question had hung in the air for years. It wasn't just about the jewels, it was about defiance, loyalty, and identity. Why did Diana wear it anyway? And when Catherine asked that very question, everything changed. There are some questions no one asks because they already know the answer. Or worse, because they're afraid of it. Catherine had been trained to smile through silence, to carry the weight of tradition without asking where it came from. But the flame had left something burning in her, a quiet unrest that grew louder with time. The refusal to explain, the abrupt retraction, the sealed recording, and above all, the stories left unfinished. She didn't start with confrontation. She started in whispers, in rooms where eyes darted before anyone spoke. A former dresser who once worked with Diana claimed to remember a moment in 1987, an event without cameras, a gathering few even knew had happened. And Diana, resplendent in a tiara that was never logged, never named, and never seen again. Not the Cambridge Lover's knot. Not any from the known collection. It was red, heavy, and breathtaking. The dresser remembered because, after that night, the princess cried. Not for attention, not for sadness, but for something deeper. As if she'd won a battle no one else knew she was fighting. Catherine pressed further, speaking with a photographer who had captured thousands of royal moments, but remembered being barred from that particular evening. He'd been told it was a private engagement, though foreign dignitaries were in attendance. He recalled hearing rumors of a tiara that shouldn't have been worn, one that had been locked away since before Elizabeth's reign. But Diana had worn it, publicly, boldly, and no one ever mentioned it again. Still, none of it made sense, until Catherine, years earlier, had been gifted a book from the Royal Library, a biography of Queen Alexandra. She hadn't opened it in ages, but something compelled her now. Buried in its pages was a folded slip of notepaper, yellowed at the edges, handwritten in blue ink. If they tell you not to, ask why. If they never answer, you already know. Signed simply, D. Her breath caught. It wasn't a message. It was a map. A torch passed from one woman to another, and with it, a final nudge toward the question she had been afraid to ask. She waited until the timing was right, if such a thing ever existed. And then, in a hallway lined with portraits of women who had worn crowns and paid for them, Catherine stopped a senior aide. She looked him in the eye, steady and unblinking. Why did she wear it anyway? He didn't ask who she was. He didn't pretend not to understand. He just turned away. And hours later, the doors that had stayed shut for decades opened without ceremony. No announcements, no applause, just a file, a recording, a final set of instructions the Queen had left for the woman who dared ask. It wasn't defiance. It was awakening. Catherine hadn't broken the rules. She had finally acknowledged that they existed and chose to confront them head-on. And in that moment, everything shifted. The silence that had guarded legacy cracked, and the crown, so often a symbol of weight, became something else entirely. What Catherine learns next does not just change her understanding of the past, it changes her role in the future. Hidden in the folds of royal protocol was a clause, centuries old, quietly erased from public record in 1953. It didn't just define inheritance, it defined worthiness. And by its measure, one woman had every right to wear the forbidden jewels. What began as a whisper turned into a revelation too dangerous to ignore. After Catherine asked the question no one dared voice, she was handed a document, a facsimile, yellowed and creased, its seal nearly faded. Dated 1802, marked Private Provision, Crown Discretion. It had never been presented to Parliament. It had never made the official archives. But it was real. It was a clause embedded in royal tradition, forged during the reign of a monarch who had survived a violent rebellion and knew that blood alone was not enough to preserve the throne. The clause declared that certain royal jewels, specifically those passed through maternal lineage, were not to be claimed by title or proximity, but by something else entirely. Character, sacrifice, proof of devotion beyond duty. In short, they were to go to the woman who endured the weight of the crown without needing to wear it. For generations, this clause had been quietly followed, never questioned. It explained why some queens wore little, while consorts wielded symbols far greater than their official role. But in 1953, just after Elizabeth's coronation, the clause was quietly buried. Not repealed, not struck out, just removed from the path of inquiry. It was said that Elizabeth herself had ordered its removal, fearing that too many might use it to justify unwelcome claims. Claims from outsiders, from those who hadn't been born royal but had suffered like one. When Catherine read it, the meaning struck her like thunder. It wasn't written for birthright. It was written for belonging. And suddenly, the pieces fell into place. Diana, hounded, idolized, sacrificed, and ultimately destroyed by the machine she married into, had qualified by its every measure. She hadn't asked for power. She had become the proof of what it cost. And now, Catherine stood on that same precipice, not born into it, not bred for it, but reshaped by it. She had endured silence, scrutiny, and the slow erosion of self that comes with royal life. She had been loyal, invisible, dutiful. And now, she realized, perhaps that was the currency. Not titles, not birthright, but survival. And in surviving, she had earned what others had been denied. But knowing the truth and claiming it are not the same thing. Catherine was no fool. She understood the risk. To act on this clause would be seen as defiance. It would pit her against those who held power not by merit, but by legacy. It could create rifts within the firm, strain her marriage, even ignite the press in ways that echoed the very chaos she had sought to avoid. And yet, how could she ignore what had been hidden from her, from all of them? Was silence noble or complicit? In that moment, she was torn between reverence for the women who had worn the burden before her, and a quiet rage that they had been silenced by rules written to keep them beneath their worth. She had spent years bowing to tradition, but now she understood. Tradition had always bowed to power. And perhaps, just this once, Power needed to bow to truth. And then, against every protocol, tradition, and threat, Catherine made her choice. There were no cameras, no official record. But on the eve of a private state dinner, she stepped into the drawing room, head held high, and wore the tiara they'd told her she could never touch. What followed would ripple through the monarchy forever. It wasn't an act of rebellion. It wasn't even planned. It was a decision carved from silence, sharpened by years of watching, waiting, obeying. Catherine had made her choice days before, in quiet, alone. With the claws in one hand, Diana's folded note in the other, and the weight of a lineage that had always demanded silence from its women. But that night, surrounded not by the public, but by power, she acted. The dinner was intimate. No journalists, no photos, just senior royals, foreign dignitaries, and the heavy, invisible air of expectation. When she walked in, the room fell still. The Duchess's flame sat atop her head like a crown of fire, ruby at its center, refracting a legacy no one could deny. It wasn't just the jewel. It was what it meant, that she had touched the untouchable, that she had walked straight into the mythology the monarchy had buried for decades and brought it back to life. Gasps whispered across crystal glass. Forks paused midair. And then came the murmur, low and unmistakable, from a senior courtier whose family had served for generations. She knows. No one elaborated. They didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what had just happened. William's face said everything: pride, fear, awe, and something else: uncertainty. Later that night, he would speak the words that echoed in her chest long after the applause faded. You can't undo this. But she hadn't come to undo anything. She'd come to reveal it, to put the truth on her head and let the silence carry the message. And then came the speech. It wasn't political. It wasn't provocative. It was calculated and quiet, crafted to leave its mark without ever naming its target. And yet, one line cracked through the facade like thunder. Legacy is not what we inherit. It's what we dare. Eyes locked. Hands fidgeted. Across the table, the unspoken war between obedience and authenticity flickered in every breath. Catherine had done what no one expected. She hadn't challenged the system. She had exposed it. The next morning, the palace was in motion. Private meetings held behind layers of secrecy, unmarked cars arriving through back entrances, reports circled, questions about protocol, warnings about setting precedents, fears of what might come next. The flame had been worn, the seal broken. What had been controlled for decades was now in play. Some called it bold, others reckless, but none could deny it. Something had shifted. And while the public remained unaware, for now, the foundations within the firm had been quietly shaken. The monarchy was watching, waiting to see if this was a moment or a movement. But if she thought the battle was over, she hadn't yet opened the final envelope. It was hidden beneath the tiara's case, stitched under velvet. A letter from one woman to another. The signature: Diana. The message: a final truth, never meant for the world, but for the next to try. Weeks had passed since Catherine wore the flame. The world hadn't seen it. But behind palace walls, the impact still echoed. She had kept the tiara in her private possession, temporarily, discreetly, until the aides would no doubt request its return. One afternoon, alone and restless, she opened the case again. Not to wear it, just to hold it, to feel what it meant, now that everything had changed. And as she lifted the lining, her fingers caught on a stitch too thick to be accidental. Carefully, she pulled it loose. The envelope was small, worn by time. No seal. Just 2 words written in slanted script across the front. To the next. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was unmistakable. And the first line cut straight to the truth Catherine had spent years chasing. If you're reading this, it means you wore it. Diana had written the letter during her separation. The tone was clear, stripped of performance, softened by pain. She spoke not about fashion or protocol, but about price. The weight of the flame, the resistance she faced, the silence, the emotional toll of claiming something never meant to be hers, yet unmistakably tied to her story. She had worn it only once, just once, and the consequences had been immediate. Cold shoulders, stifled conversations, a quiet, invisible punishment. She hadn't expected applause, but she never anticipated the shame, and yet she hadn't regretted it. Not entirely. "I wore it to see if it would change anything," she wrote. It didn't. But maybe it wasn't meant to. Maybe it was meant to wait. The final lines were the kind that live in memory forever. If you're reading this, it means you were ready. And so was I. You are not alone. Not anymore. Catherine didn't cry immediately. She sat still, letting the words sink into the silence. There had been no permission, no blueprint, just 2 women, decades apart, bound by one truth: that the right to wear something doesn't always come from tradition. Sometimes it comes from survival, sometimes from defiance, but always from the choice to try. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back beneath the lining, and closed the case, not to hide it again, but to preserve it. It would not be locked away this time, not erased, not buried in silence. The jewels once forbidden are no longer just ornaments. They are testimony, not to royalty, but to resilience,